Hi there, right now this is going to be a very different sort of video to my usual fares. I'm going to get a bit nostalgic here. With this being uploaded on Halloween, I wanted to talk to you a bit about my experience of when I first went to see The Exorcist many years ago. Now I'm sure a lot of my younger fans here will be thinking, well, so what, I saw this on DVD for the first time only last year myself and it was no big deal. Well, here's the thing. Some may find this hard to imagine, but there was a time here in the UK, and it really wasn't all that long ago, that if you wanted to go see The Exorcist, then the only place you could do so was at the cinema, as the film was effectively banned on video here right up until 1999. Now this story takes place during the early 90s, I think it was about 1991, and I was in my late teens at the time. Being born in 1972, I was too young to have seen the film at the cinema first time round, and growing up as a horror fan during the 80s, I'd heard a lot about this film's infamy, so I really wanted to go see this for myself to see what all the fuss was about. Now obviously a lot of things that we take for granted these days simply weren't around back in the early 90s. There was no internet for starters, so you couldn't just go online and do a Google search for nearby cinema listings, or mail order videos from overseas like you can today. So unless you lived near a major city, it was kind of difficult to find a place that might still be showing this film occasionally. Fortunately though, the one thing we did have back then was teletext. Now, whilst today your TV's text service might just be confined to a few pages of news and providing programmes with subtitles, back then it was packed full of features like reviews, programme information and cinema listings. Now because TV companies broadcast to quite a wide area, we were able to look at the listings for cinemas that were located quite some distance away, and it was whilst looking through these pages of info we came across one cinema, which was an Odeon multiplex up in Hull, that happened to be advertising a late night screening of The Exorcist on a Saturday night. Now unfortunately this was a bit too short notice, and I think we had other plans, so we couldn't actually go see it that weekend. But we later found out that they were screening this film every Saturday night for the next few weeks. So one weekend, myself and a friend decided, what the hey, and decided to go have a drive out and go see it. Now the only thing was that I live in Lincolnshire, and this cinema was located up in Hull, which was something like a 70-mile trip, and also meant having to drive through North Lincolnshire. Now if you're familiar with my county, North Lincolnshire really is the arse end of nowhere. It's all pretty much small villages and long winding lanes, so we were looking at something like a 2-hour drive just to get to this cinema to see this one film. But this was the only way that we were going to go get to see this at the time, so off we went. Now there were no sat-navs back then either, so it was a case of scribbling the address down on a bit of paper, then having a drive round once we got there to see if we could try and find the place. Anyway, needless to say we got there alright, we found the place okay, and we got our tickets without incident. Now, as for the film itself, we all know what the plot's about, so I won't bother with a review. Now as for what I thought about it, needless to say, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good film, and indeed I still do today, though I do remember thinking I couldn't see what all the fuss was about. Those who may have heard of the outrageous stories that were bandied about this film back in the 70s of people who were running screaming from the cinema certainly weren't in evidence on that evening. No one ran out or appeared to be adversely affected by the events on the screen. When people left they just seemed to be chatting about what a good film it was, so I can only imagine that people were more easily shocked back in the early 70s.
All she had to do was wet the rug, throw up some pea soup, and everybody believed.
So, whilst I found this to be a good film, I didn't find it to be a scary film as such. In fact, being a lifelong atheist, in many ways, I find it hilariously funny, and indeed still do today. Now, to be honest, I think perhaps the only creepy part of this for me was actually the drive back home. Now, obviously when we set off, it was still daylight, and it had got dark by the time we got there. But with this being a late night screening, which I think it started at about 10 o'clock or something, by the time the film had finished and they'd kicked us all out, it was now about midnight. So there we were in a strange city, it's late at night, everywhere's closed, it's pitch black, and we've just been to see a horror film, and we have a 2-hour drive back through rural Lincolnshire in order to get home. Now I'm sure most people agree that when you're driving at night things look strangely different, particularly when you're going through the middle of nowhere, but believe me, they look even more different when you've just been to see a horror film. Anyway, I think we finally got back about 2 o'clock in the morning or something silly after making a couple of wrong turns on the trip home, which didn't exactly help, but anyway. I believe the Hull Odeon continued to show late night screenings of this film successfully for quite some time afterwards, along with several other problematic films that hadn't been given a video release at the time, and that's something you don't really see too much of today. Me and some other friends did actually plan to make a return trip there, but one of us managed to get hold of a bootleg copy of The Exorcist on videotape sometime afterwards, so we didn't bother. Now, I think I can honestly say that this was the furthest I've ever travelled just to go see a film, and was typical of the sort of lengths that some horror film fans would have to go through just to see a particular movie back then. Today we live in slightly more enlightened times. Our film censors are actually pretty liberal these days. In fact, if you look at some of the films that you can see today, like Hostel, these would never have stood a cat in hell's chance of being released back then. And what with modern technology that allows you to mail order films online or simply download them to your hard drive, I really can't imagine a scenario when anyone would need to go to such extremes in this day and age. That's why the film was banned on home video here in the UK for so long. I can only imagine that it was because the chief censor at the time, who was a chap named James Furman, must have thought people were too fragile to see this in the home, despite the fact that it had been available on home video in virtually every other civilised country for years. So it really came as no surprise that no sooner had Furman stepped down as head of the Board of Film Censors in the late 90s, the film was immediately submitted for a video classification and was then passed uncut. Anyway, that's the end of the story. I hope I haven't bored you too much with this, but I thought it might be interesting to share, as I'm sure a lot of YouTube subscribers who are of a similar age to myself could probably relate to the problems we had back in the day, and I'm sure many of the younger horror fans will be surprised at just how different things were back then, as well as the lengths we used to have to go through just to see this stuff, and how quickly things have changed. Anyway, feel free to rate and comment and tell me what you think about this. By all means, post questions if you want, or perhaps you've got a similar story about trying to see a particular film and you'd like to make a video response. Feel free to do so. But anyway, until next time.
I've seen The Exorcist about 167 times, and it keeps getting funnier every single time I see it!